Hi everyone, I'm Andrew Moore, Digital Media Lab Assistant here at Gail Borden Library, and I want to thank you for joining us for this week's Digital Media Camp, Your Library at Home. Today we're broadcasting from inside the Digital Media Lab, and we're going to talk about compression, how to use a compressor, why you would use a compressor. Well, let's get started with some simple definitions here. So what is compression? Compression means reducing an audio signal's dynamic range. Alright, so what's dynamic range? Dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and quietest point in an audio signal. So for example, if an audio signal has a peak audio at 0 decibels and the lowest point in that audio file is negative 10 decibels, that means the dynamic range of that audio file is 10 decibels. Make sense? Cool, let's move on. Why would you use compression? Compression is used to make the peak volume and the lowest volume closer to each other so that you could have a more consistent sound and reduce any spikes in volume. It's also used to master audio, make entire songs remain at a consistent volume, right? So if you have a song where the intro is an acoustic guitar and then it suddenly jumps into everything hitting at once, the drums, an electric guitar, a vocalist, a bassist, the master, depending on the taste and what the mastering engineer's idea was, but typically the compression on the master track would be to make that quiet point of the acoustic guitar and that loud point where everything comes in more even, so that you as the consumer don't have to turn the radio up and down all the time throughout the different dynamic changes in a song. So it's as far as mastering audio goes, compression is used to get a consistent level through an entire song, and then also from one song to the next when you're dealing with albums. Compression is used in many stages of the recording process, so it's not just like you throw a compressor on at the end. You're typically going to be using compression, at least in music, through all stages of it. So you're going to put it on the vocals, you're going to put it on the instrument tracks, and the reason you're doing that again is to make the performance even throughout. Alright, so compression takes the highest point and the lowest point and then compresses them so that they're close together, right, or closer together. So let's see some examples here. I'm going to start off with a very exaggerated speaking voice. So I purposely talked quite quiet and then quite loud just to show you a good example of how compression works. So this is without the compressor on.
This is an example for test audio. Right now I am talking quietly. But if I begin to talk loud like this, I may need to use a compressor in order to even out my voice to a more solid level that is consistent throughout the recording.
Alright, cool. So that was without the compressor on. Now I'm going to turn the compression on.
This is an example for test audio. Right now I am talking quietly. But if I begin to talk loud like this, I may need to use a compressor in order to even out my voice to a more solid level that is consistent throughout the recording.
Alright, so you'll notice that you could obviously tell the differences in the pitch of my voice from when I go from the lower tones to the louder tones, but volume wise, once I put the compressor on, you can see that they're much closer to one another. So I had to really go heavy on the compression here. I'll show you what I did, and I'll talk about what each of these things mean here as well: threshold, ratio, knee, attack, etc. Alright, so again, I started with nothing on here, and the audio's all over the place.
But if I begin to
Very
talk
loud.
loud like this, I may need to use a compressor in order to even out my voice to a more solid level.
Alright, so when we turn the compressor on, I'll start off by talking about the threshold. So the threshold is the point in which the compressor is going to kick on. I have it set to negative 35, so if you watch this, when it's at a quiet point,
This is an example.
the compressor's not even engaged right now.
Right now I am talking
Now you see the needle
But if I
move a
begin to
bit.
talk loud like this,
So you
I
see
may
when
need
I'm
to use
talking
a
loud, that
compressor in
needle's
order
really
to
moving
even
on there,
out
right?
my
So that's
voice.
because it hits the threshold. That means that the compressor's not going to engage at all until it gets to that threshold point. So I set this to negative 35 decibels. So that means anytime that the audio gets above negative 35 decibels, this compressor is going to kick on. Anything that's quieter than negative 35 decibels is not going to get touched. And that's that's a typical strategy that I use with compression. I don't want the compression to compress things that don't need to be compressed, right? I just only want it to hit those peak volumes in order to bring those peak volumes down closer to the quieter one, so that I could then at the end stage turn it all up and have it be a consistent volume. So I set my threshold at -35. Again, the threshold is where the compressor is going to engage. All right. So then I set my ratio really high on this one at 22:1. I set it high because there's such big fluctuations in the volume. Usually when I'm recording music vocals, there's not so much range in the vocal, and I'll usually set it much lower of a ratio than that. So what the ratio means, you see here it says 22.0 to 1. So what that means is that for every 22 decibels of amplitude that come in, this compressor is going to crunch that down to 1. So 22 becomes 1, right? If I set this down to 1.0 to 1, that means nothing's happening. Alright, so listen to the difference here.
Example for test audio. Right now I am talking quietly. But if I begin to talk loud like this, I may need to use a compressor in order to even out my voice to a more solid level.
Alright, so 1 to 0 is nothing, and then, so for example 1.2 would be every 1.2 decibels that comes in gets crunched down to 1. So that's minimal compression. 2.2, again, every 2.2 decibels of amplitude that comes in gets compressed down to 1. Alright, so we're going to go back way up where we were. I think it was at 22, if I'm not mistaken. So makeup gain here. You see I have it at 0 decibels. Auto gain's off. I could set my auto gain to either off, which means it's not going to put any gain. Gain is basically, when we compress the sound, it makes the waveform smaller, so then you're losing volume. So if you want to make it appear louder again, then you have to use gain to make up for what you lost in the compression. I have it set to off. If I were to set it to 0...
This is an example for test audio. Right now I am...
So that was super loud. That's set to auto gain up to 0 decibels. You don't ever want to get above 0 decibels. I know that might sound counterintuitive because 0 is the lowest number on our numeric scale. That's not a negative, right? But you always want 0 to be your absolute peak volume. Anything above 0 causes distortion within the audio file. So you don't want to ever get above 0. So 0, auto gaining up to 0, boost everything up to the loudest it could possibly be without distortion. So that's why you saw that get so loud. Putting it to -12 will put everything to -12.
This is an
decibels,
example
right?
for test
So
audio.
-12.
Right now I am
0,
talking quietly. But if
off.
I begin to talk loud...
I tend to keep auto gain off a lot of the time so that I could use the makeup gain as I want to, but a lot of times I'll also set it to -12, which is where it starts by default in Logic. I'll set it to -12 on in music and when I have multiple vocal takes, so that I could then be pretty sure that every vocal take is going to be roughly the same volume range without touching the makeup gain too much. Alright, so there we went through threshold, we went through ratio, what makeup gain is. Something to keep in mind, I used to think this, and a lot of people think that compression makes your audio file louder. The reason you probably would think that, and why I used to think that, is because, like I said, the preset on a lot of these compressors sets it to -12. So it's, if you had an audio signal that was below -12 before, say -16, -14, then putting a compressor on it and then setting the auto gain or the makeup gain to get to a level of -12 is going to make it louder. But it's not the compressor, it's not the compression that made the audio file louder. I'm sorry. It's the makeup gain that actually made the audio file louder. So compression shrinks the audio files, but then often gain is added after compression to make up for the loss in volume there. Alright, so let's talk about this knee. I like to explain knee. It makes more sense to me by showing it on a graph than a meter. So you see, as I move this point right in this area, it changes. So a knee that's 1 is the furthest up it could go. The closer to 1 you get, the more rounded of a change you're going to have. So for example, if I have it at 0, that means that when the audio hits this threshold level, it's going to immediately flatten out to the level that I set things to the it's at 22 to 1, so it's immediately going to crunch down those 22 into 1 as soon as it hits the threshold, right? But the more closer to 1 I get, the more you see it round out. Right, so if I do all the way up to 1, then that means it's going to engage at -35, but it's going to have a more slanted or more circular slope to get down to the 22 to 1. The attack and the release, I think of attack and release similar to driving a car. So how long does it take to go from 0 to 60? It's like if you step on the pedal, you don't immediately start going 60 miles an hour. It's similar for the attack time. Right now I have it at 10.5 milliseconds. That means it takes 10.5 milliseconds for when the audio hits this threshold of -35 to become fully engaged. So that's a pretty quick attack time. If I went up to 200 milliseconds, that's a slow attack time. That means it would take 200 milliseconds from when this compressor first engages to become fully engaged. So it'd be like if it takes you 6 seconds to go from 0 to 60, right? You step on your pedal, your attack time would essentially be 6 seconds, right? Your attack time is obviously that's not what you call it in driving. But so on your compressor, if you have a 10.5 millisecond attack time, that means when your compressor first gets engaged by hitting the level that you set your threshold at, that's how long it takes it to become fully engaged, right? So that means in 10.5 seconds it goes from on to fully on. Right? If I set it to 200, that's a slower attack time. That means it would take 200 milliseconds for the compressor to go from starting to turn on to being completely engaged. Right? The release time is just the exact opposite of that. How long does it take to get back down to not being engaged anymore? So that would be in driving terms. How long does it take before you let go of the pedal, the gas pedal, for you to become completely stopped? Or how long does it take from when you step on that brake to become a complete stop? Right, so the release time that I have it set to here is 81 milliseconds. That means from when the compressor gets to a point where it no longer needs to be engaged anymore because it's at a volume that's lower than the threshold, that it's going to take 81 milliseconds for the compressor to be off. Right, so the attack is how long does it take to be not engaged, or first engaged to fully engaged, and the release is how long does it take to be fully engaged to not engaged at all. Alright, so let's look on the metering here.
This is an example.
If I change the attack times.
Right now I am talking quietly. But if I begin to talk loud like this, I may need to use a compressor.
So see, when I change the release, see how long it takes that needle to fall back down?
That is consistent throughout the recording.
As opposed to if I put it here?
This is an example for test audio. Right now I am talking.
See that bouncing?
But if I begin to talk loud like this, I
disengages frequently, right? Now if I turn it up,
even out my voice to a more
almost never disengages, because as it's still disengaging, it gets triggered again. All right, so those are some, that's the basics of compression. That's how you could read all these things that are on here: your threshold, your ratio, your makeup gain, knee, attack, and release. You may have other plugins that are on your compressor depending on what you use, like you see the limiter here. What the limiter does is whatever you set that to, it makes sure that your audio is not going to get beyond that point. It also can boost gain, the gain of the entire file without ensuring that it doesn't get beyond a certain point. Your distortion, we'll talk about that later with music. It's a little easier to illustrate. Your output gain. So these are things that aren't quite as technical as what's on the inside here: your threshold, ratio, attack, release, knee, etc. So now that you know how it works, let's move on to a different application here. So we just saw sample audio, how you can use compression when there's a voice that's unequal, somebody who's yelling at one point and then maybe speaking at another, to even out that volume. A new session. What we're gonna work on right now is the intro track to a project that I'm releasing later on this year called Dark Skies, Tainted Water. I have a bunch of audio files that I got from different news sources and that I string together. So because they were from different sources, they had different volume levels, and rather than, I did go in and you can see and manually change the volumes of each one to make it so the compressor didn't have to do so much work, because if you over compress, it tends to degrade, it degrades the quality of the audio. Really, every time you compress, you're losing something. You're losing that dynamic range, which is what you're trying to achieve, but you want to use it tastefully so that you don't lose so much that it just becomes, it doesn't sound good anymore. So I'm going to play just I'm going to cut out the music, and I'm only going to play the speaking here.
Very good reason why so many of us seem to be always coughing.
Compressor's
In fact,
off now, right?
communities throughout the United States could be dying because of pollutants found in the air.
Almost 1 in 7 children live in areas with high levels of outdoor.
Communities throughout the United States could be dying because of.
Now I'm going to turn it on.
Communities throughout the United States could be dying because of pollutants found in the air.
Almost 1 in 7 children
See how
live
it's
in areas
working
with
here?
high levels of outdoor air pollution.
Tainted water was found from New Jersey to California.
We were being told it's safe, it's okay.
So I try to watch that needle and see how that needle's bouncing, and I want it to be engaged sometimes, but not engaged all the time. If it's always engaged, that probably means that I'm over compressing. So these, like I said, they all came from different sources, and I wanted them to all be closer to equal without having to do too much volume. So I did all the edits of EQ and panning and everything that I wanted, and then I put them into what's called a bus. So I basically routed all, I don't know, maybe looks like 20 of these audio samples here, and I then they're all on 20 separate tracks, or it looks like maybe a few less, 19 separate tracks, and then I bust them all to the same channel so that I could use the same EQ setting and the same compressor on all of those tracks, rather than have a compressor on every single track. I could put a compressor on all those tracks so that they're affected in the same way. So I wanted them to be affected the same way so that they could sound even throughout. And here's
More
a
than
little
half of all people in
example
the United
with the
States live in
music.
counties that have unhealthy levels of smog and pollution.
Air is so polluted that it's darkening the
There could
sky.
be a very good reason why
Compressor
so
off.
many of us seem to be always coughing. In fact, people in communities throughout the United States could be dying because of pollutants found in the air.
Compressor on.
Almost 1 in 7 children.
So like I said before, it appears louder when I turn the compressor on, right? But that's because, like I said before, the auto gain is on there. So that's another reason why I wanted to use the same compression settings on all of these files, so they would all regulate to an average level, that -12, and be, roughly in the same range. Music and vocal combination setting. Now we're going to talk about how you could use it on certain instruments. So I'm going to start with the 808 bass. Alright, so I'm going to show you how to use a compressor on an 808 bass to get that real chunky, distorted sound that you hear in a lot of hip-hop music. So check it out, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Alright, let's hear that same audio before the compression. Huge difference, right? So now let me show you what I did there. Alright, so going into our compression, you see I turned my ratio pretty high, 5:1. My threshold at -37. So that means it's gonna hit every one of those bass notes. I wanted it to hit every one. I turned my attack to 3.5, my release to 17, so quick attack, quick release. I turned my auto gain to -12, and then I turned, I believe, the distortion, the gain up 9 decibels. So I wanted this to sound distorted, to have that real chunky sound. So like I said, it started this soft, right? Turn that down, and so let me show you how to get to that. Just gonna start everything kind of more at a default level. Makeup gain I had way up there too, right? Alright, so I'm gonna turn my ratio up first, because that's how I'm gonna be able to see actually what's going on, right? So I'm at 5:1. That means for every 5 decibels that come in, it's crunching it down to 1. Alright, now I'm going to set my threshold. Like I said, I want it to hit. Let me just make sure it hits all those notes. So I want to get a crunchy, more distorted sound, right? So I'm gonna. Oh, actually, I still got this gain up. So if I turn the attack up, you see it's a little more longer of a punch when it hits, and I turn this attack down, and it's more of a quick. Alright, I'm gonna turn the release way down too. Alright. So if I turn the release up, hear how that longness goes away? Now it's back. Alright. Now if I really want to get that distortion sound, now I'm going to start turning up the gain. The more you do that, see, that's a little too much for my taste, right? But that's how you could achieve that sound. So those real loud, booming 808 bass sounds that you hear in a lot of rap music, dance music, R&B music, that's a combination. I'm sure there's multiple ways to achieve it, but the way that I usually achieve it is by using compression and then really cranking that makeup gain to a point where it's distorted. Some compressors even have a distortion button on it. Let me see if I can find one in here. Yeah, I don't see it on any of the ones that I'm here to, but you could actually add distortion on some compressors as well. So that's how you could use it in a musical application. Throw it on a bass and really use it heavily. That's a more heavy application of compression than you're going to use to try and even out sound. That's for effect, the way that I showed you there. So we learned first, how do you use compression to even out a voice, right? You got somebody who's talking loud at one point, quiet at another one. How do you get those crunched down so that they could be at a more even level? Then we learned taking audio from different sources, which when I showed you those different news clips, and then how to get audio from different sources to a more unified point using compression. So those are both practical, everyday applications for somebody who's using compression and audio. And then what I showed you now is a more specialized, effects-based application for compression. How to get that real boomy, long 808 sound. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions or feedback, please feel free to send me an email. If you are interested in more digital media, digital audio stuff, there's plenty more videos, so you could check out the YouTube and Facebook playlist of Digital Media Camp, and you can see videos from both myself and Andre Dyson, who is the supervisor at the Digital Media Lab here. Thank you all for tuning in. Send me an email, like I said, for questions and feedback, and go to gailborden.info to find out information on all of the library happenings. Hope to see you soon here in the Digital Media Lab or elsewhere in Gail Borden Public Library. Thanks. Bye.